Niccolo Machiavelli was born in 1469, the same year that Lorenzo de' Medici assumed the title of Prince of Florence. It was the golden age of the Italian Renaissance, an age that has bequeathed to us the masterpieces of Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. But it was also an age of violent political intrigue, assassination, even open warfare between the rival kingdoms and cities of Italy, Naples, Rome, Venice, Florence, and Milan. It was the age of the Borgias. In Machiavelli's lifetime, Italy was twice invaded by the French. The Medici dynasty twice overturned in Florence, and in 1527, 5 years before Machiavelli's death, Rome was sacked by invaders. After the death of the first Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, and following several years of political confusion in the 1490s, Florence became a republic. Machiavelli was elected to an influential office in the government, and served ably, even with distinction, for 13 years. But with a new invasion of the French army, Florence, in panic, turned again to the Medicis, and so Machiavelli found himself exiled to a small farm on the hills of Tuscany. There he reflected on power and its abuse, on politics and man. His reflections we now know as The Prince. He dedicated his book to the new Lorenzo, grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent, hoping that the prince would recall him to public service. He was disappointed. He died in 1532, and The Prince wasn't published until 5 years later. It is a remarkable testament to a man and his times. And now, The Prince.
To Lorenzo the Magnificent, son of Piero de' Medici. It's customary for those who wish to gain the favor of a prince to endeavor to do so by offering him gifts of those things which they hold most precious, or in which they know him to take especial delight. In this way princes are often presented with horses, arms, cloth of gold, gems, and such like ornaments worthy of their grandeur. In my desire, however, to offer to your Highness some humble testimony of my devotion, I've been unable to find among my possessions anything which I hold so dear or esteem so highly as that knowledge of the deeds of great men which I have acquired through a long experience of modern events and a constant study of the past. With the utmost diligence, I've long pondered and scrutinized the actions of the great, and now I offer the results to your Highness within the compass of a small volume. And although I deem this work unworthy of your Highness's acceptance, yet my confidence in your humanity assures me that you will receive it with favor, knowing that it is not in my power to offer you a greater gift than that of enabling you to understand in a very short time all those things which I have learnt at the cost of privation and danger in the course of many years. I've not sought to adorn my work with long phrases or high-sounding words, or any of those superficial attractions and ornaments with which many writers seek to embellish their material, as I desire no honor for my work but such as the novelty and gravity of its subject may justly deserve. Nor will it, I trust, be deemed presumptuous on the part of a man of humble and obscure condition to attempt to discuss and direct the government of princes. For in the same way that landscape painters station themselves in the valleys in order to draw mountains or high ground, and ascend an eminence in order to get a good view of the plains, so it's necessary to be a prince to know thoroughly the nature of the people, and one of the populace to know the nature of princes. May I trust, therefore, that your Highness will accept this little gift in the spirit in which it is offered, and if your Highness will deign to peruse it, you will recognize in it my ardent desire that you may attain to that grandeur which fortune and your own merits presage for you. And should your Highness gaze down from the summit of your lofty position towards this humble spot, you will recognize the great and unmerited sufferings inflicted on me by a cruel fate. Chapter 1. The various kinds of government and the ways by which they are established. All states and dominions which hold or have held sway over mankind are either republics or monarchies. Monarchies are either hereditary, in which the rulers have been for many years of the same family, or else they are of recent foundation. The newly founded ones are either entirely new, as was Milan to Francesco Sforza, or else they are, as it were, new members grafted on to the hereditary possessions of the prince that annexes them, as is the kingdom of Naples to the king of Spain. The dominions thus acquired have either been previously accustomed to the rule of another prince, or else have been free states, and they are annexed either by force of arms of the prince himself or of others, or else fall to him by good fortune or special ability. Chapter 2. Of Hereditary Monarchies. I will not here speak of republics, having already treated of them fully in another place. I will deal only with monarchies, and will discuss how the various kinds described above can be governed and maintained. In the first place, the difficulty of maintaining hereditary states accustomed to a reigning family is far less than in new monarchies, for it's sufficient not to transgress ancestral usages, and to adapt oneself to unforeseen circumstances. In this way, such a prince, if of ordinary assiduity, will always be able to maintain his position, unless some very exceptional and excessive force deprives him of it. And even if he be thus deprived, on the slightest mischance happening to the new occupier, he will be able to regain it. We have in Italy the example of the Duke of Ferrara, who was able to withstand the assaults of the Venetians in 1484 and of Pope Julius in 1510 for no other reason than because of the antiquity of his family in that dominion. Inasmuch as the legitimate prince has less cause and less necessity to give offense, it's only natural that he should be more loved. And if no extraordinary vices make him hated, it's only reasonable for his subjects to be naturally attached to him, the memories and causes of innovations being forgotten in the long period over which his rule has extended, whereas one change always leaves the way prepared for the introduction of another. Chapter 3. Of Mixed Monarchies. But it is in the new monarchy that difficulties really exist. First, if it's not entirely new, but a member, as it were, of a mixed state, its disorders spring at first from a natural difficulty which exists in all new dominions, because men change masters willingly, hoping to better themselves. And this belief makes them take arms against their rulers, in which they are deceived, as experience later proves that they have gone from bad to worse. This is the result of another very natural cause, which is the inevitable harm inflicted on those over whom the prince obtains dominion, both by his soldiers and by an infinite number of other injuries caused by his occupation. Thus you find enemies in all those whom you have injured by occupying that dominion, and you can't maintain the friendship of those who have helped you to obtain this possession, as you will not be able to fulfill their expectations, nor can you use strong measures with them, being under an obligation to them. For which reason, however strong your armies may be, you'll always need the favor of the inhabitants to take possession of a province. It was from these causes that Louis XII of France, though able to occupy Milan without trouble, immediately lost it, and the forces of Ludovico alone were sufficient to take it from him the first time. For the inhabitants who had willingly opened their gates to him, finding themselves deluded in the hopes they had cherished, and not obtaining those benefits they had anticipated, couldn't bear the vexatious rule of their new prince. It's indeed true that after reconquering rebel territories, they are not so easily lost again, for the ruler is now, by the fact of the rebellion, less averse to secure his position by punishing offenders, unmasking suspects, and strengthening himself in weak places. So that, although the mere appearance of such a person as Duke Ludovico on the frontier was sufficient to cause France to lose Milan the first time. To make her lose her grip of it the second time was only possible when all the world was against her, and after her armies had been defeated and driven out of Italy, which was the result of the causes above mentioned. Nevertheless, it was taken from her both the first and the second time. The general causes of the first loss have already been discussed. It remains now to be seen what were the causes of the second loss, and by what means France could have avoided it, or what measures might have been taken by another ruler in that position, which were not taken by the King of France. Be it observed, therefore, that those states which on annexation are united to a previously existing state may or may not be of the same nationality and language. If they are, it's very easy to hold them, especially if they're not accustomed to freedom. And to possess them securely, it suffices that the family of the princes which formerly governed them be extinct. For the rest, their old condition not being disturbed, and there being no dissimilarity of customs, the people settle down quietly under their new rulers, as is seen in the case of Burgundy, Brittany, Gascony, and Normandy, which have been so long united to France. And although there may be some slight differences of language, the customs of the people are nevertheless similar, and they can get along well together. Whoever obtains possession of such territories and wishes to retain them must bear in mind two things. The one, that the blood of their old rulers be extinct. The other, to make no alteration either in their laws or in their taxes. In this way, they'll in a very short space of time become united with their old possessions and form one state. But when dominions are acquired in a province differing in language, laws, and customs, the difficulties to be overcome are great, and it requires good fortune as well as great industry to retain them. One of the best and most certain means of doing so would be for the new ruler to take up his residence there. This would render possession more secure and durable, and it is what the Turk has done in Greece. In spite of all the other measures taken by him to hold that state, it wouldn't have been possible to retain it had he not gone to live there. Being on the spot, disorders can be seen as they arise, and can quickly be remedied. But living at a distance, they are only heard of when they get beyond remedy. Besides which, the province is not despoiled by your officials, the subjects being able to obtain satisfaction by direct recourse to their prince. And wishing to be loyal, they have more reason to love him. And should they be otherwise inclined, they'll have greater cause to fear him. Any external power who wishes to assail that state will be less disposed to do so. So that as long as he resides there, he'll be very hard to dispossess. The other and better remedy is to plant colonies in one or two of those places which form as it were the keys of the land. For it's necessary either to do this or to maintain a large force of armed men. The colonies will cost the prince little. With little or no expense on his part, he can send and maintain them. He only injures those whose lands and houses are taken to give to the new inhabitants, and these form but a small proportion of the state, and those who are injured, remaining poor and scattered, can never do any harm to him. And all the others are, on the one hand, not injured and therefore easily pacified, and on the other are fearful of offending, lest they should be treated like those who have been dispossessed. To conclude, these colonies cost nothing, are more faithful, and give less offense, and the injured parties, being poor and scattered, are unable to do mischief, as I've shown. For it must be noted that men must either be caressed or else annihilated. They'll revenge themselves for small injuries, but cannot do so for great ones. The injury, therefore, that we do to a man must be such that we need not fear his vengeance. But by maintaining a garrison instead of colonists, one will spend much more and consume all the revenues of that state in guarding it, so that the acquisition will result in a loss, besides giving much greater offense, since it injures everyone in that state with the quartering of the army on it, which being an inconvenience felt by all, everyone becomes an enemy. And these are enemies which can do mischief, as though beaten they remain in their own homes. In every way, therefore, a garrison is as useless as colonies are useful. Further, The ruler of a foreign province, as described, should make himself the leader and defender of his less powerful neighbors, and endeavor to weaken the stronger ones, and take care that they're not invaded by some foreigner not less powerful than himself. And it will always be the case that he'll be invited to intervene at the request of those who are discontented, either through ambition or fear, as was seen when the Aetolians invited the Romans into Greece. And in whatever province they entered, it was always at the request of the inhabitants. And the rule is that when a powerful foreigner enters a province, all the less powerful inhabitants become his adherents, moved by the envy they bear to those ruling over them. So much so that with regard to these minor potentates, he has no trouble whatever in winning them over, for they willingly join forces with the state that he has acquired. He has merely to be careful that they don't assume too much power and authority, and he can easily with his own forces in their favor put down those that are powerful and remain in everything arbiter of that province. And he who doesn't govern well in this way will soon lose what he has acquired, and while he holds it will meet with infinite difficulty and trouble. The Romans, in the provinces they took, always followed this policy. They established colonies, inveigled the less powerful without increasing their strength, put down the most powerful, and didn't allow foreign rulers to obtain influence in them. I'll adduce the province of Greece as a sole example. They made friends with the Achaeans and the Aetolians. The kingdom of Macedonia was cast down, and Antiochus driven out. Nor did they allow the merits of the Achaeans or the Aetolians to gain them any increase in territory. Nor did the persuasions of Philip induce them to befriend him without reducing his influence. Nor could the power of Antiochus make them consent to allow him to hold any state in that province. For the Romans did in these cases what all wise princes should do, who consider not only present but also future discords, and diligently guard against them. For being foreseen, they can easily be remedied. But if one waits till they're at hand, the medicine is no longer in time, as the malady has become incurable. It happening with this as with those hectic fevers, as doctors say, which at their beginning are easy to cure, but difficult to recognize. But in course of time, when they have not at first been recognized and treated, become easy to recognize and difficult to cure. Thus it happens in matters of state. For knowing afar off, which it is only given to a prudent man to do, the evils that are brewing, they are easily cured. But when for want of such knowledge they are allowed to grow so that every one can recognize them, there's no longer any remedy to be found. Therefore the Romans, observing disorders while yet remote, were always able to find a remedy, and never allowed them to increase in order to avoid a war. For they knew that war is not to be avoided, and can be deferred only to the advantage of the other side. They therefore declared war against Philip and Antiochus in Greece, so as not to have to fight with them in Italy, though they might at the time have avoided either. This they didn't choose to do, never caring to do that which is now every day to be heard in the mouths of our wise men, namely to enjoy the advantages of delay, but preferring to trust their own virtue and prudence. For time brings with it all things, and may produce indifferently either good or evil. But let's return to France and examine whether she did any of these things. And I will speak not of Charles, but of Louis as the one whose proceedings can be better seen, as he held position in Italy for a longer time. You will then see that he did the opposite of all those things which must be done to keep possession of a foreign state. King Louis was called into Italy by the ambition of the Venetians, who wished by his coming to gain half of Lombardy. I won't blame the king for coming, nor for the part he took, because wishing to plant his foot in Italy and not having friends in the country, on the contrary, the conduct of King Charles having caused all doors to be closed to him, he was forced to accept what friendships he could find, and his schemes would have speedily been successful if he had made no mistakes in his other proceedings. The king, then, having acquired Lombardy, immediately won back the reputation lost by Charles. Genoa yielded. The Florentines became his friends. The Marquis of Mantua, the Dukes of Ferrara and Bentivogli, the Lady of Forlì, the lords of Faenza, Pesaro, Rimini, Camerino, and Piombino, the inhabitants of Lucca, of Pisa, and of Siena, all approached him with offers of friendship. The Venetians might then have seen the effects of their temerity. How, to gain a few cities in Lombardy, they had made the king ruler over 2/3 of Italy. Consider how little difficulty the king would have had in maintaining his reputation in Italy if he had observed the aforesaid rules, and kept a firm and sure hold over all those friends of his who, being many in number, and weak and fearful, one of the church, another of the Venetians, were always obliged to hold fast to him, and by whose aid he could easily make sure of any who were still great. But he was hardly in Milan before he did exactly the opposite, by giving aid to Pope Alexander to occupy the Romagna. Nor did he perceive that in taking this course he weakened himself, by casting off his friends and those who had fled to his protection, and strengthened the church by adding further temporal powers to the spiritual power which gives it such authority. And having made the first mistake, he was obliged to follow it up, whilst, to put a stop to the ambition of Alexander, and prevent him becoming ruler of Tuscany, he was forced to come to Italy. And not content with having increased the power of the church and lost his friends, he now, coveting the kingdom of Naples, divided it with the king of Spain. And where he alone was the arbiter of Italy, he now brought in a companion, so that the ambitious of that province who were dissatisfied with him might have someone else to appeal to, and where he might have left in that kingdom a king tributary to himself, he dispossessed him in order to bring in another who was capable of driving him out. The desire to acquire possessions is a very natural and ordinary thing, and when those men do it who can do so successfully, they're always praised and not blamed. But when they can't and yet want to do so at all costs, they make a mistake deserving of great blame. If France, therefore, with her own forces could have taken Naples, she ought to have done so. If she couldn't, she ought not to have shared it. And if the partition of Lombardy with the Venetians is to be excused as having been the means of allowing the French king to set foot in Italy, this other partition deserves blame, not having the excuse of necessity. Louis had thus made these 5 mistakes. He had crushed the smaller powers, increased the power in Italy of one potentate, brought into the land a very powerful foreigner. He hadn't come to live there himself, nor had he established any colonies. Still, these mistakes, if he had lived, might not have injured him, had he not made the 6th, that of taking the state from the Venetians. For if he hadn't strengthened the church and brought the Spaniards into Italy, it would have been right and necessary to humble them. Having once taken those measures, he ought never to have consented to their ruin, because had the Venetians been strong, it would have kept the others from making attempts on Lombardy. Partly because the Venetians wouldn't have consented to any measures by which they didn't get it for themselves, and partly because the others wouldn't have wanted to take it from France to give it to Venice, and wouldn't have had the courage to attack both. If anyone urges that King Louis yielded Romagna to Alexander and the kingdom of Naples to Spain in order to avoid war, I reply with the reasons already given, that one ought never to allow a disorder to take place in order to avoid war. For war is not thereby avoided, but only deferred to your disadvantage. And if others allege the promise given by the king to the Pope to undertake that enterprise for him in return for the dissolution of his marriage and for the cardinalship of Rohan, I reply with what I shall say later on about the faith of princes and how it is to be observed. Thus, King Louis lost Lombardy through not observing any of those conditions which have been observed by others who have taken provinces and wished to retain them. Nor is this any miracle, but very reasonable and natural. I spoke of this matter with Cardinal Rohan at Nantes when Valentine, as Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander was commonly called, was occupying the Romagna. For on Cardinal Rohan saying to me that the Italians didn't understand war, I replied that the French didn't understand politics, for if they did, they would never allow the Church to become so great. And experience shows us that the greatness in Italy of the Church and also of Spain have been caused by France, and her ruin has proceeded from them. From which may be drawn as a general rule, which never or very rarely fails, that whoever is the cause of another becoming powerful is ruined himself. For that power is produced by him either through craft or force, and both of these are suspected by the one who has been raised to power. Chapter 5. The way to govern cities or dominions that, previous to being occupied, lived under their own laws. When those states which have been acquired are accustomed to live at liberty under their own laws, there are 3 ways of holding them. The first is to despoil them. The second is to go and live there in person. The third is to allow them to live under their own laws, taking tribute of them, by creating within the country a government composed of a few who will keep it friendly to you. Because this government, being created by the prince, knows that it cannot exist without his friendship and protection, and will do all it can to keep them. What's more, a city used to liberty can be more easily held by means of its citizens than in any other way if you wish to preserve it. There's the example of the Spartans and the Romans. The Spartans held Athens and Thebes by creating within them a government of a few. Nevertheless, they lost them. The Romans, in order to hold Capua, Carthage, and Numantia, ravaged them, but didn't lose them. They wanted to hold Greece in almost the same way as the Spartans held it, leaving it free and under its own laws, but they didn't succeed. So that they were compelled to lay waste many cities in that province in order to keep it. Because in truth, there's no sure method of holding them except by despoiling them. And whoever becomes the ruler of a free city and doesn't destroy it can expect to be destroyed by it, for it can always find a motive for rebellion in the name of liberty and of its ancient usages, which are forgotten neither by lapse of time nor by benefits received. And whatever one does or provides, so long as the inhabitants are not separated or dispersed, they don't forget that name and those usages, but appeal to them at once in every emergency. As did Pisa after so many years held in servitude by the Florentines. But when cities or provinces have been accustomed to live under a prince, and the family of that prince is extinguished, being on the one hand used to obey and on the other not having their old prince, they can't unite in choosing one from among themselves, and they don't know how to live in freedom, so that they are slower to take arms, and a prince can win them over with greater facility and establish himself securely. But in republics, there is greater life, greater hatred, and more desire for vengeance. They don't and can't cast aside the memory of their ancient liberty, so that the surest way is either to lay them waste or reside in them. Chapter 6. Of new dominions which have been acquired by one's own arms and ability. Let no one marvel if in speaking of new dominions both as to prince and state, I bring forward very exalted instances. For men walk almost always in the paths trodden by others, proceeding in their actions by imitation. Not being always able to follow others exactly, nor attain to the excellence of those he imitates, a prudent man should always follow in the path trodden by great men, and imitate those who are most excellent, so that if he doesn't attain to their greatness, at any rate he will get some tinge of it. He will do as prudent archers, who when the place they wish to hit is too far off, knowing how far their bow will carry, aim at a spot much higher than the one they wish to hit, not in order to reach this height with their arrow, but by help of this high aim to hit the spot they wish to. I say, then, that in new dominions where there is a new prince, it's more or less easy to hold them according to the greater or lesser ability of him who acquires them. And as the fact of a private individual becoming a prince presupposes either great ability or good fortune, it would appear that either of these things would in part mitigate many difficulties. Nevertheless, those who have been less beholden to good fortune have maintained themselves best. The matter is also facilitated by the prince being obliged to reside personally in his territory, having no others. But to come to those who have become princes through their own merits and not by fortune, I regard as the greatest Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus, and their like. And although one shouldn't speak of Moses, he having merely carried out what was ordered him by God, still he deserves admiration, if only for that grace which made him worthy to speak with God. But regarding Cyrus and others who have acquired or founded kingdoms, they will all be found worthy of admiration, and if their particular actions and methods are examined, they won't appear very different from those of Moses, although he had so great a master. And in examining their life and deeds, it will be seen that they owed nothing to fortune, but the opportunity which gave them matter to be shaped into what form they saw fit. And without that opportunity, their powers would have been wasted. And without their powers, the opportunity would have come in vain. It was thus necessary that Moses should find the people of Israel slaves in Egypt and oppressed by the Egyptians, so that they were disposed to follow him in order to escape from their servitude. It was necessary that Romulus should be unable to remain in Alba, and should have been exposed at his birth, in order that he might become king of Rome and founder of that nation. It was necessary that Cyrus should find the Persians discontented with the empire of the Medes, and the Medes weak and effeminate through long peace. Theseus couldn't have shown his abilities if he hadn't found the Athenians dispersed. These opportunities, therefore, gave these men their chance, and their own great abilities enabled them to profit by them, so as to ennoble their country and augment its fortunes. Those who, by the exercise of abilities such as these, become princes, obtain their dominions with difficulty, but retain them easily. And the difficulties which they have in acquiring their dominions arise in part from the new rules and regulations that they have to introduce in order to establish their position securely. It must be considered that there's nothing more difficult to carry out, nor more doubtful of success, nor more dangerous to handle, than to initiate a new order of things. For the reformer has enemies in all those who profit by the old order, and only lukewarm defenders in all those who would profit by the new order, this lukewarmness arising partly from fear of their adversaries, who have the laws in their favor, and partly from the incredulity of mankind, who don't truly believe in anything new until they have had actual experience of it. Thus it arises that on every opportunity for attacking the reformer, his opponents do so with the zeal of partisans. The others only defend him half-heartedly, so that between them he runs great danger. It's necessary, however, in order to investigate thoroughly this question, to examine whether these innovators are independent, or whether they depend upon others. That is to say, whether in order to carry out their designs, they have to entreat or are able to compel. In the first case, they invariably succeed ill, and accomplish nothing. But when they can depend on their own strength and are able to use force, they rarely fail. Thus it comes about that all armed prophets have conquered and unarmed ones failed. For besides what has been already said, the character of people varies, and it's easy to persuade them of a thing, but difficult to keep them in that persuasion. And so it's necessary to order things so that when they no longer believe, they can be made to believe by force. Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus wouldn't have been able to keep their constitutions observed for so long had they been disarmed, as happened in our own time with Fra Girolamo of Savonarola, who failed entirely in his new rules when the multitude began to disbelieve in him, and he had no means of holding fast those who had believed, nor of compelling the unbelievers to believe. Therefore such men as these have great difficulty in making their way, and all their dangers are met on the road and must be overcome by their own abilities. But when once they have overcome them, and have begun to be held in veneration, and have suppressed those who envied them, they remain powerful and secure, honored and happy. To the high examples given, I will add a lesser one, which, however, is in some measures comparable and will serve as an instance in all such cases, that of Hiero of Syracuse, who from a private individual became prince of Syracuse without other aid from fortune beyond the opportunity. For the Syracusans, being oppressed, elected him as their captain, from which post he rose by ability to be prince. While still in private life, his virtues were such that it was written of him that he lacked nothing to reign but the kingdom. He abolished the old militia, raised a new one, abandoned his old friendships, and formed others. And as he had thus friends and soldiers of his own choosing, he was able on this foundation to build securely, so that while he had great trouble in acquiring his position, he had little in maintaining it. Chapter 7. Of new dominions acquired by the power of others or by fortune. Those who rise from private citizens to be princes merely by fortune have little trouble in rising, but very much in maintaining their position. They meet with no difficulties on the way as they fly over them, but all their difficulties arise when they are established. Such are they who are granted a state either for money or by favor of him who grants it, as happened to many in Greece, in the cities of Ionia and of the Hellespont, who were created princes by Darius in order to hold these places for his security and glory. Such were also those emperors who from private citizens rose to power by bribing the army. Such as these depend absolutely on the goodwill and fortune of those who have raised them, both of which are extremely inconstant and unstable. They neither know how to, nor are in a position, to maintain their rank. For unless he be a man of great genius, it's not likely that one who has always lived in a private position should know how to command. And they're unable to maintain themselves because they possess no forces friendly and faithful to them. Moreover, states quickly founded, like all other things of rapid beginnings and growth, can't have deep roots and wide ramifications, so that the first storm destroys them, unless, as already said, the man who thus becomes a prince is of such great genius as to be able to take immediate steps for maintaining what fortune has thrown into his lap, and lay afterwards those foundations which others make before becoming princes. With regard to these two methods of becoming a prince, by ability or by good fortune, I will here adduce two examples which have occurred within our memory, those of Francesco Sforza and Cesare Borgia. Francesco, by appropriate means and through great abilities, from citizen became Duke of Milan, and what he had attained after 1,000 difficulties, he maintained with little trouble. On the other hand, Cesare Borgia, commonly called Duke Valentine, acquired the state by the influence of his father, and lost it when that influence failed. And that, although every measure was adopted by him and everything done that a prudent and capable man could do, to establish himself firmly in a state that the arms and the favors of others had given him. For as we've said, he who doesn't lay his foundations beforehand may, by great abilities, do so afterwards, although with great trouble to the architect and danger to the building. If then one considers the procedure of the Duke, it will be seen how firm were the foundations he had laid to his future power, which I don't think is superfluous to examine, as I know of no better precepts for a new prince to follow than may be found in his actions. And if his measures weren't successful, it was through no fault of his own, but only by the most extraordinary malignity of fortune. In wishing to aggrandize the Duke his son, Alexander VI had to meet very great difficulties, both present and future. In the first place, he saw no way of making him ruler of any state that wasn't a possession of the Church. He knew that the Duke of Milan and the Venetians wouldn't consent in his attempt to take papal cities, because Faenza and Rimini were already under the protection of the Venetians. He saw, moreover, that the military forces of Italy, especially those which might have served him, were in the hands of those who would fear the greatness of the Pope, and therefore he couldn't depend upon them, being all under the command of the Orsini and Colonna and their adherents. It was therefore necessary to disturb the existing condition and bring about disorders in the states of Italy in order to obtain secure mastery over a part of them. This was easy, for he found the Venetians who, actuated by other motives, had invited the French into Italy, which he not only didn't oppose, but facilitated by dissolving the first marriage of King Louis. The king came thus into Italy with the aid of the Venetians and the consent of Alexander, and had hardly arrived at Milan before the Pope obtained troops from him for his enterprise in the Romagna, which was made possible for him thanks to the reputation of the king. The Duke, having thus obtained the Romagna and defeated the Colonna, was hindered by two things in maintaining it and proceeding further. The one, his forces, of which he doubted the fidelity; the other, the will of France. That is to say, he feared lest the arms of the Orsini, of which he had availed himself, should fail him, and not only hinder him in obtaining more, but take from him what he had already conquered. And he also feared that the king might do the same. He had evidence of this as regards the Orsini, when after taking Faenza he assaulted Bologna, and observed their backwardness in the assault. And as regards the king, he perceived his designs when, after taking the dukedom of Urbino, he attacked Tuscany, and the king made him desist from that enterprise. Whereupon the duke decided to depend no longer on the fortunes and arms of others. The first thing he did was to weaken the parties of the Orsini and Colonna in Rome, by gaining all their adherents who were gentlemen and making them his own followers, by granting them large remuneration, and appointing them to commands and offices according to their rank, so that their attachment to their parties was extinguished in a few months, and entirely concentrated on the duke. After this, he awaited an opportunity for crushing the chiefs of the Orsini, having already suppressed those of the Colonna family. And when the opportunity arrived, he made good use of it. For the Orsini, seeing at length that the greatness of the duke and of the church meant their own ruin, convoked a diet at Magione in the Perugino. Hence sprang the rebellion of Urbino, and the tumults in Romagna, and infinite dangers to the duke, who overcame them all with the help of the French. And having regained his reputation, neither trusting France nor other foreign forces, in order not to venture on their alliance, he had recourse to stratagem. He dissembled his aims so well that the Orsini made their peace with him, being represented by Signor Paolo, whose suspicions the duke disarmed with every courtesy, presenting him with robes, money, and horses, so that in their simplicity they were induced to come to Sinigalia and fall into his hands. Having thus suppressed these leaders and made their partisans his friends, the duke had laid a very good foundation to his power, having all the Romagna, with the duchy of Urbino, and having gained the favor of the inhabitants, who began to feel the benefit of his rule. And as this part is worthy of note and of imitation by others, I won't omit mention of it. When he took the Romagna, it had previously been governed by weak rulers, who had rather despoiled their subjects than governed them, and given them more cause for disunion than for union, so that the province was a prey to robbery, assaults, and every kind of disorder. He, therefore, judged it necessary to give them a good government in order to make them peaceful and obedient to his rule. For this purpose he appointed Messer Ramiro de Orco, a cruel and able man, to whom he gave the fullest authority. This man in a short time was highly successful in rendering the country orderly and united, whereupon the duke, not deeming such excessive authority expedient lest it should become hateful, appointed a civil court of justice in the center of the province under an excellent president, to which each city appointed its own advocate. And as he knew that the harshness of the past had engendered some amount of hatred, in order to purge the minds of the people, and to win them over completely, he resolved to show that if any cruelty had taken place, it was not by his orders, but through the harsh disposition of his minister. And having found the opportunity, he had him cut in half and placed one morning in the public square at Cesena, with a piece of wood and blood-stained knife by his side. The ferocity of this spectacle caused the people both satisfaction and amazement. But to return to where we left off. The Duke, being now powerful and partly secured against present perils, being armed himself and having in a great measure put down those neighboring forces which might injure him, had now to get the respect of France if he wished to proceed with his acquisitions, for he knew that the king, who had lately discovered his error, wouldn't give him any help. He began therefore to seek fresh alliances, and to vacillate with France on the occasion of the expedition that the French were undertaking toward the kingdom of Naples against the Spaniards, who were besieging Gaeta. His intention was to assure himself of them, which he would soon have succeeded in doing if Alexander had lived. These were the measures taken by him with regard to the present. As to the future, he feared that a new successor to the states of the Church might not be friendly to him, and might seek to deprive him of what Alexander had given him, and he sought to provide against this in 4 ways. First, by destroying all who were of the blood of those ruling families which he had despoiled, in order to deprive the Pope of any opportunity. Secondly, by gaining the friendship of the Roman nobles, so that he might through them hold, as it were, the Pope in check. Thirdly, by obtaining as great a hold on the college as he could. Fourthly, by acquiring such power before the Pope died as to be able to resist alone the first onslaught. Of these 4 things he had at the death of Alexander accomplished 3, and the 4th he had almost accomplished. For of the dispossessed rulers he killed as many as he could lay hands on, and very few escaped. He had gained to his party the Roman nobles, and he had a great influence in the college. As to new possessions, he designed to become Lord of Tuscany, and already possessed Perugia and Piombino, and had assumed the protectorate over Pisa. And as he had no longer to fear the French, for the French had been deprived of the kingdom of Naples by the Spaniards in such a way that both parties were obliged to buy his friendship, he seized Pisa. After this, Lucca and Siena at once yielded, partly through hate of the Florentines, and partly through fear. The Florentines had no resources, so that had he succeeded as he had done before in the very year that Alexander died, he would have gained such strength and renown as to be able to maintain himself without depending on the fortunes or strength of others, but solely on his own power and ability. But Alexander died 5 years after Cesare Borgia had first drawn his sword. He was left with only the state of Romagna firmly established, and all the other schemes in mid-air, between 2 very powerful and hostile armies, and suffering from a fatal illness. But the valor and ability of the Duke were such, and he knew so well how to win over men or vanquish them, and so strong were the foundations that he had laid in this short time, that if he hadn't had those 2 armies upon him, or else had been in good health, he would have survived every difficulty. And that his foundations were good is seen from the fact that the Romagna waited for him more than a month in Rome. Although half dead, he remained secure. And although the Baglioni, Vitelli, and Orsini entered Rome, they found no followers against him. He was able, if not to make Pope whom he wished, at any rate to prevent a Pope being created whom he didn't wish. But if at the death of Alexander he had been well, everything would have been easy. And he told me on the day that Pope Julius II was elected that he had thought of everything which might happen on the death of his father, and provided against everything, except that he had never thought that at his father's death he would be dying himself. Reviewing thus all the actions of the Duke, I find nothing to blame. On the contrary, I feel bound, as I have done, to hold him up as an example to be imitated by all who by fortune and with the arms of others have risen to power. For with his great courage and high ambition he couldn't have acted otherwise, and his designs were only frustrated by the short life of Alexander and his own illness. Whoever therefore deems it necessary in his new principality to secure himself against enemies, and to gain friends, to conquer by force or fraud, to make himself beloved and feared by the people, followed and reverenced by the soldiers, to destroy those who can and may injure him, introduce innovations into old customs, to be severe and kind, magnanimous and liberal, suppress the old militia, create a new one, maintain the friendship of kings and princes in such a way that they are glad to benefit him and fear to injure him, such a one can find no better example than the actions of this man. The only thing he can be accused of is that in the creation of Julius II he made a bad choice. For as has been said, not being able to choose his own pope, he could still prevent any one individual being made pope, and he ought never to have permitted any of those cardinals to be raised to the papacy whom he had injured, or who, when pope, would stand in fear of him. For men commit injuries either through fear or through hate. Those whom he had injured were, among others, San Pietro ad Vincula, Colonna, San Giorgio, and Ascanio. All the others, if elected to the pontificate, would have had to fear him, except Rohan and the Spaniards. The latter through their relationship and obligations to him, the former from his great power being related to the King of France. For these reasons, the Duke ought above all things to have created a Spaniard pope. And if unable, then he should have consented to Rohan being appointed, and not San Pietro ad Vincula. And whoever thinks that in high personages new benefits cause old offenses to be forgotten makes a great mistake. The Duke, therefore, erred in this choice, and it was the cause of his ultimate ruin. Chapter 8. Of those who have attained the position of prince by villainy. But as there are still two ways of becoming prince which cannot be attributed entirely either to fortune or to ability, they mustn't be passed over, although one of them could be more fully discussed if it were treating of republics. These are when one becomes prince by some nefarious or villainous means, or when a private citizen becomes the prince of his country through the favor of his fellow citizens. And in speaking of the former means, I'll give two examples, one ancient, the other modern, without entering further into the merits of this method, as I judge them to be sufficient for anyone obliged to imitate them. Agathocles the Sicilian rose not only from private life, but from the lowest and most abject position to be king of Syracuse. The son of a potter, he led a life of the utmost wickedness through all the stages of his fortune. Nevertheless, his wickedness was accompanied by such vigor of mind and body that having joined the militia he rose through its ranks to be praetor of Syracuse. Having been appointed to this position, and having decided to become prince and to hold with violence and without the support of others that which had been constitutionally granted him, and having imparted his design to Hamilcar, the Carthaginian, who was fighting with his armies in Sicily, he called together one morning the people and senate of Syracuse, as if he had to deliberate on matters of importance to the republic, and at a given signal had all the senators and the richest men of the people killed by his soldiers. After their death he occupied and held rule over the city without any civil strife. And although he was twice beaten by the Carthaginians and ultimately besieged, he was able not only to defend the city, but leaving a portion of his forces for its defense, with the remainder he invaded Africa, and in a short time liberated Syracuse from the siege and brought the Carthaginians to great extremities, so that they were obliged to come to terms with him, and remain contented with the possession of Africa, leaving Sicily to Agathocles. Whoever considers, therefore, the actions and qualities of this man will see few, if any, things which can be attributed to fortune. For, as above stated, it wasn't by the favor of any person, but through the grades of the militia, in which he had advanced with 1,000 hardships and perils, that he arrived at the position of prince, which he afterwards maintained by so many courageous and perilous expedients. It can't be called virtue to kill one's fellow citizens, betray one's friends, be without faith, without pity, without religion. By these methods one may indeed gain power, but not glory. For if the virtues of Agathocles in braving and overcoming perils, and his greatness of soul in supporting and surmounting obstacles be considered, one sees no reason for holding him inferior to any of the most renowned captains. Nevertheless, his barbarous cruelty and inhumanity, together with his countless atrocities, don't permit of his being named among the most famous men. We can't attribute to fortune or virtue that which he achieved without either. In our own times, during the pontificate of Alexander VI, Oliverotto da Fermo had been left as a young fatherless boy under the care of his maternal uncle, Giovanni Fogliani, who brought him up and sent him in early youth to soldier under Paolo Vitelli, in order that he might, trained in that hard school, obtain a good military position. On the death of Paolo, he fought under his brother Vitellozzo, and in a very short time, being of great intelligence and active in mind and body, he became one of the leaders of his troops. But deeming it servile to be under others, he resolved, with the help of some citizens of Fermo, who preferred servitude to the liberty of their country, and with the favor of the Vitelli, to occupy Fermo. He therefore wrote to Giovanni Fogliani how, having been for many years away from home, he wished to come to see him in his city, and as far as possible to inspect his estates. And as he had only labored to gain honor in order that his fellow citizens might see that he had not spent his time in vain, he wished to come honorably accompanied by 100 horsemen, his friends and followers, and prayed him that he would be pleased to order that he should be received with honor by the citizens of Fermo, by which he would not only honor him, Oliverotto, but also himself, as he had been his pupil. Giovanni didn't fail in any due courtesy towards his nephew. He caused him to be honorably received by the people of Fermo, and lodged him in his own house. After waiting some days to arrange all that was necessary to his villainous projects, Oliverotto invited Giovanni Fogliani and all the principal men of Fermo to a grand banquet. After the dinner and the entertainments usual at such feasts, Oliverotto artfully introduced certain important matters of discussion, speaking of the greatness of Pope Alexander and of his son Cesare, and of their enterprises. To which discourses Giovanni and others having replied, he all at once rose, saying that these matters should be spoken of in a more private place, and withdrew into a room where Giovanni and the other citizens followed him. They were no sooner seated than soldiers rushed out of hiding places and killed Giovanni and all the others. After which massacre, Oliverotto mounted his horse, rode through the town, and besieged the chief magistrate in his place, so that, through fear, they were obliged to obey him and form a government of which he made himself prince. And all those being dead who, if discontented, could injure him, he fortified himself with new orders, civil and military, in such a way that within the year that he held the principality, he was not only safe himself in the city of Fermo, but had become formidable to all his neighbors. And his overthrow would have been difficult, like that of Agathocles, if he hadn't allowed himself to be deceived by Cesare Borgia, when he captured the Orsini and Vitelli at Sinigalia, as already related, where he also was taken 1 year after the parricide he had committed, and strangled, together with Vitellozzo, who had been his teacher in ability and atrocity. Some may wonder how it came about that Agathocles and others like him could, after infinite treachery and cruelty, live secure for many years in their country and defend themselves from external enemies without being conspired against by their subjects. Although many others have, owing to their cruelty, been unable to maintain their position in times of peace, not to speak of the uncertain times of war. I believe this arises from the cruelties being exploited well or badly. Well committed may be called those, if it is permissible to use the word well of evil, which are perpetrated once for the need of securing oneself, and which afterwards are not persisted in, but are exchanged for measures as useful to the subjects as possible. Cruelties ill committed are those which, although at first few, increase rather than diminish with time. Those who follow the former method may remedy in some measure their condition both with God and man, as did Agathocles. As to the others, it's impossible for them to maintain themselves. Whence it is to be noted that in taking a state the conqueror must arrange to commit all his cruelties at once, so as not to have to recur to them every day, and so as to be able, by not making fresh changes, to reassure people and win them over by benefiting them. Whoever acts otherwise, either through timidity or bad counsel, is always obliged to hand, and can never depend on his subjects, because they, owing to continually fresh injuries, are unable to depend upon him. For injuries should be done all together, so that being less tasted, they will give less offense. Benefits should be granted little by little, so that they may be better enjoyed. And above all, a prince must live with his subjects in such a way that no accident of good or evil fortune can deflect him from his course. For necessity arising in adverse times, you're not in time with severity, and the good that you do doesn't profit, as it is judged to be forced upon you, and you will derive no benefit whatever from it. Chapter 9. Of the Civic Principality. But we now come to the case where a citizen becomes prince, not through crime or intolerable violence, but by the favor of his fellow citizens, which may be called a civic principality. To obtain this position depends not entirely on worth or entirely on fortune, but rather on cunning assisted by fortune. One attains it by help of popular favor or by the favor of the aristocracy. For in every city these two opposite parties are to be found, arising from the desire of the populace to avoid the oppression of the great, and the desire of the great to command and oppress the people. And from these two opposing interests arises in the city one of the three effects, either absolute government, liberty, or license. The former is created either by the populace or the nobility, depending on the relative opportunities of the two parties. For when the nobility see that they are unable to resist the people, they unite in exalting one of their number and creating him prince, so as to be able to carry out their own designs under the shadow of his authority. He who becomes prince by help of the nobility has greater difficulty in maintaining his power than he who is raised by the populace, for he is surrounded by those who think themselves his equals, and is thus unable to direct or command as he pleases. But one who is raised to leadership by popular favor finds himself alone, and has no one, or very few, who are not ready to obey him. Besides which, it's impossible to satisfy the nobility by fair dealing and without inflicting injury on others, whereas it's very easy to satisfy the mass of the people in this way. For the aim of the people is more honest than that of the nobility, the latter desiring to oppress, and the former merely to avoid oppression. It must also be added that the prince can never insure himself against a hostile populace on account of their number, but he can against the hostility of the great, as they are but few. The worst that a prince has to expect from a hostile people is to be abandoned, but from hostile nobles he has to fear not only desertion but their active opposition. And as they are more far-seeing and more cunning, they're always in time to save themselves, and take sides with the one who they expect will conquer. The prince is moreover obliged to live always with the same people, but he can easily do without the same nobility, being able to make and unmake them at any time, and improve their position or deprive them of it as he pleases. And to throw further light on this part of my argument, I would say that the nobles are to be considered in two different manners. That is, they are either to be ruled so as to make them entirely dependent on your fortunes, or else not. Those that are thus bound to you and are not rapacious must be honored and loved. Those who stand aloof must be considered in two ways. They either do this through pusillanimity and natural want of courage, and in this case you ought to make use of them, and especially such as are of good counsel, so that they may honor you in prosperity, and in adversity you have not to fear them. But when they are not bound to you of set purpose and for ambitious ends, It's a sign that they think more of themselves than of you. And from such men the prince must guard himself, and look upon them as secret enemies, who will help to ruin him when in adversity. One, however, who becomes prince by favor of the populace must maintain its friendship, which he will find easy. The people ask nothing but not to be oppressed. But one who against the people's wishes becomes prince by favor of the nobles should above all endeavor to gain the favor of the people. This will be easy to him if he protects them. And as men who receive good from whom they expected evil feel under a greater obligation to their benefactor, so the populace will soon become even better disposed towards him than if he had become prince through their favor. The prince can win their favor in many ways, which vary according to circumstances, for which no certain rule can be given, and will therefore be passed over. I'll only say, in conclusion, that it's necessary for a prince to possess the friendship of the people. Otherwise, he has no resource in times of adversity. Nabis, prince of the Spartans, sustained a siege by the whole of Greece and a victorious Roman army, and defended his country against them, and maintained his own position. It sufficed when the danger arose for him to make sure of a few, which would not have sufficed if the populace had been hostile to him. And let no one oppose my opinion in this by quoting the trite proverb, "He who builds on the people builds on mud," because that's true when a private citizen relies upon the people and persuades himself that they will liberate him if he is oppressed by enemies or by magistrates. In this case, he might often find himself deceived, as were in Rome the Gracchi, and in Florence Messer Giorgio Scali. But when it's a prince who founds himself on this basis, one who can command and is a man of courage and doesn't get frightened in adversity, and doesn't neglect other preparations, and one who by his own valor and measure animates the mass of the people, he won't find himself deceived by them, and he will find that he has laid his foundations well. Usually these principalities are in danger when the prince from the position of a civil ruler changes to an absolute one. For these princes either command themselves or by means of magistrates. In the latter case their position is weaker and more dangerous, for they're at the mercy of those citizens who are appointed magistrates, who can, especially in times of adversity, with great facility deprive them of their position, either by acting against them or by not obeying them. The prince is not in time in such dangers to assume absolute authority. For the citizens and subjects who are accustomed to take their orders from the magistrates aren't ready in these emergencies to obey his, and he will always, in difficult times, lack men whom he can rely on. Such a prince can't base himself on what he sees in quiet times when the citizens have need of the state, for then everyone is full of promises, and each one is ready to die for him when death is far off. But in adversity, when the state has need of citizens, then he will find but few. And this experience is the more dangerous, in that it can only be had once. Therefore, a wise prince will seek means by which his subjects will always and in every possible condition of things have need of his government, and then they will always be faithful to him. Chapter 10. How the strength of all states should be measured. In examining the character of these principalities, it's necessary to consider another point, namely, whether the prince has such position as to be able in case of need to maintain himself alone, or whether he has always need of the protection of others. The better to explain this, I would say that I consider those capable of maintaining themselves alone who can, through abundance of men or money, put together a sufficient army and hold the field against any one who assails them. And I consider to have need of others those who cannot take the field against their enemies, but are obliged to take refuge within their walls and stand on the defensive. We've already discussed the former case, and will speak of it in future as occasion arises. In the second case, there's nothing to be said except to encourage such a prince to provision and fortify his own town, and not to trouble about the surrounding country. And whoever has strongly fortified his town, and as regards the government of his subjects has proceeded as we have already described, and will further relate, will be attacked with great reluctance. For men are always averse to enterprises in which they foresee difficulties, and it can never appear easy to attack one who has his town stoutly defended and isn't hated by the people. The cities of Germany are absolutely free, have little surrounding country, and obey the emperor when they choose, and they don't fear him or any other potentate that they have about them. They are fortified in such a manner that everyone thinks that to reduce them would be tedious and difficult, for they all have the necessary moats and bastions, sufficient artillery, and always keep food, drink, and fuel for 1 year in the public storehouses. Beyond which, to keep the lower classes satisfied and without loss to the Commonwealth, they have always enough means to give them work for 1 year in these employments which form the nerve and life of the town, and in the industries by which the lower classes live. Military exercises are still held in high reputation, and many regulations are in force for maintaining them. A prince, therefore, who possesses a strong city and doesn't make himself hated, can't be assaulted. And if he were to be so, the assailant would be obliged to retire shamefully. For so many things change that it's almost impossible for anyone to maintain a siege for a year with his armies idle. And to those who urge that the people, having their possessions outside and seeing them burnt, will not have patience, and the long siege and self-interest will make them forget their prince, I reply that a powerful and courageous prince will always overcome these difficulties, by now raising the hopes of his subjects that the evils won't last long, now impressing them with fear of the enemy's cruelty, now by dexterously assuring himself of those who appear too bold. Besides which, the enemy would naturally burn and ravage the country on first arriving, and at the time when men's minds are still hot and eager to defend themselves. And therefore the prince has still less to fear, for after some time, when people have cooled down, the damage is done, the evil has been suffered, and there's no remedy, so that they are the more ready to unite with their prince, as it appears that he is under an obligation to them, their houses having been burnt and their possessions ruined in his defense. It's the nature of men to be as much bound by the benefits that they confer as by those they receive, from which it follows that everything considered, a prudent prince won't find it difficult to uphold the courage of his subjects both at the commencement and during a state of siege, if he possesses provisions and means to defend himself. Chapter 11. Of Ecclesiastical Principalities. It now only remains to us to speak of ecclesiastical principalities, with regard to which the difficulties lie wholly before they are possessed. They're acquired by either ability or by fortune, but are maintained without either. For they're sustained by ancient religious customs which are so powerful and of such quality that they keep their princes in power in whatever manner they proceed and live. These princes alone have states without defending them, have subjects without governing them, and their states, not being defended, are not taken from them. Their subjects, not being governed, don't resent it, and neither think nor are capable of alienating themselves from them. Only these principalities, therefore, are secure and happy. But as they're upheld by higher causes which the human mind can't attain to, I will abstain from speaking of them. For being exalted and maintained by God, it would be the work of a presumptuous and foolish man to discuss them. However, I might be asked how it has come about that the Church has reached such great temporal power, when previous to Alexander VI, the Italian potentates, and not merely the really powerful ones, but every lord or baron, however insignificant, held it in slight esteem as regards temporal power, whereas now it is dreaded by a king of France, whom it has been able to drive out of Italy, and has also been able to ruin the Venetians. Therefore, although this is well known, I don't think it superfluous to call it to mind. Before Charles, King of France, came into Italy, this country was under the rule of the Pope, the Venetians, the King of Naples, the Duke of Milan, and the Florentines. These potentates had to have two chief cares. One, that no foreigner should enter Italy by force of arms. The other, that none of the existing governments should extend its dominions. Those chiefly to be watched were the Pope and the Venetians. To keep back the Venetians required the alliance of all the others, as in the defense of Ferrara, and to keep down the Pope they made use of the Roman barons. These were divided into two factions, the Orsini and the Colonna. And as there was constant quarreling between them, and they were constantly under arms before the eyes of the Pope, they kept the papacy weak and infirm. And although there arose now and then a resolute pope, like Sextus, yet his fortune or ability was never able to liberate him from these evils. The shortness of their life was the reason for this, for in the course of 10 years, which, as a general rule, a pope lived, he had great difficulty in suppressing even one of the factions. And if, for example, a pope had almost put down the Colonna, a new pope would succeed who was hostile to the Orsini, which caused the Colonna to spring up again, and he wasn't in time to suppress them. This caused the temporal power of the Pope to be of little esteem in Italy. Then arose Alexander VI, who of all the pontiffs who have ever reigned best showed how a pope might prevail both by money and by force. With Duke Valentine as his instrument, and seizing the opportunity of the French invasion, he did all that I have previously described in speaking of the actions of the Duke. And although his object was to aggrandize not the Church but the Duke, what he did resulted in the aggrandizement of the Church, which after the death of the Duke became the heir of his labors. Then came Pope Julius, who found the Church powerful, possessing all Romagna, all the Roman barons suppressed, and the factions destroyed by the severity of Alexander. He also found the way open for accumulating wealth in ways never used before the time of Alexander. These measures were not only followed by Julius, but increased. He resolved to gain Bologna, put down the Venetians, and drive the French from Italy, in all which enterprises he was successful. He merits the greater praise as he did everything to increase the power of the Church, and not of any private person. He also kept the Orsini and Colonna parties in the condition in which he found them. And although there were some leaders among them who might have made changes, there were two things that kept them steady. One, the greatness of the Church, which they dreaded. The other, the fact that they had no cardinals, who are the origin of the tumults among them. For these parties are never at rest.